Ok, caro Gabriele, dovremmo essere in diretta, quindi siamo in diretta in un orario un po' strano, ma io passo immediatamente all'inglese, se siete d'accordo. So, hello everyone, we are live now. This is not our usual timeline because usually we go live in the evening, but today we have an international guest. You can see her immediately because she is visible. She is Deborah Lupton, one of the editor of this book, The Face Mask in COVID Times, a Sociomaterial Analysis, published by the Gruyter in 2021. Is a really recent book, of course, because the topic is recent too, unfortunately. The book is edited by Deborah, but also by Clare Southerton, Marianne Clark, and Ash Watson. We have also, Gabriele, today a special discussant, Marco Viola. You can see him with his wonderful mask on his face, because Marco is here as a representative of facets, because of course we are talking about masks. So we thought it was good to insert this special episode into the project we are working on in this period. I will, as always, give just a brief summary of this book, which is a not so long book, but quite interesting, because of course the argument is an argument globally widespread, and everybody has to do with this strange thing that is the face sanitary mask. And it is interesting to notice that the approach is an interdisciplinary approach, because we have, of course, a sociological perspective, I'd say mixed with cultural studies, because in the book the cultural problems related to bodies, genders, minorities, and masks are pretty well emphasized and underlined. But of course, face masks configure a material problem. They are objects, they are artifacts, they are made with certain materials. And so one of the main core business of the book is how to put together this materiality with the cultural, sociological things related to this materiality. So the book is divided into a series of macro chapters, which put in comparison, as I said, the socio-materialism related to the mask, but also all the political issues which are implied by this new way to inhabit our new reshaped society after the pandemic. There is also, and I think it's quite interesting, a kind of analysis about a new semantic configuration of the briefing. So what does it mean to brief with the mask on, and how this thing is intertwined with other political issues? For example, the very sad and well-known phrase, "I can't brief," a phrase we all know because of the things happened in the United States in 2020. And of course, as I said, all the also quite nice, quite funny, but relevating issues related to the crafting of the masks. So the homemade masks, the artisan mask, and so on and so forth. And last but not least, the common ground of this book, I think one of the common grounds of this book, I think, is the idea of the care. What is the care, and how can we understand the care nowadays. I don't want to go further because it was just a brief introduction. Of course, as maybe we didn't say, but today is a kind of express episode, so we have 1 hour. So probably we won't have time to go deeper into all the arguments touched by this book, but we will do our best. I immediately give the floor to Gabriele in order to introduce our guest and the editors of the book, and then we go freely into our discussion.
So thank you, Bruno. I would like to say thank you so much to Deborah, who accepted our invitation, because this book is really in overlap with our topic subject of interest in the project Facets. And for us as semioticians and philosophers, it is interesting to compare methodologies and approaches. So I think that this is a very it is a very good example of how on topics such as these we can share experiences and methodologies and data. So I will give the floor to Deborah, but I just wanted to introduce her a little bit for our audience. Deborah is a Sharp Professor in the Center for Social Research in Health and the Social Policy Research Center at the University of New South Wales at Sydney, and she's the leader of the Vitalities Lab, which is a sociological, mediological, and culturological research center of study. She did a lot of things, and so I will be really quick in the presentation, but I wanted to underline that she's really keen on the idea of studying how, whether and to which extent is it possible from an ethical perspective to put together automated decision making and society. So automated decision making policies and how we make it possible for society to go on and develop in an ethical way. She runs a very interesting blog in sociology, which is called The Sociological Life. And as Bruno was mentioning, she's not the only author of this book. I will just quickly address also the other authors and curators, who are Marianne Clark, Clare Southerton, and Ash Watson. They are all the three of them are postdoctoral fellow at the very same lab and research center at the very same university. So they are a research group, and they deal with issues converging in this paradigm that actually I was not aware of, because I'm ignorant of a lot of things, but so I was not aware that sociomaterialism was a paradigm, and so I'm really curious to talk about that. And they converge on this paradigm, which is very interesting for semiotics, and now we are going to say why, from very different perspectives, but they are converging. So gender and health, for example, intimacy and sexuality. And then also there is a kind of pinch of sociological fiction, because one of the author, Ash, is specialized in this field. So I think it's kind of theory fiction in a sociological perspective, which is something that here in Italy we do not have. So we have to learn a lot of things. I will conclude just by saying that, yes, sociomaterialism is the paradigm within which the book is framed. And for us as semioticians, that is interesting because we share some roots, we share some origins, because obviously, for example, Foucault and his biopolitics are one important source to this approach that, as Bruno was saying, tries to put together how things are not just things, but rather subjects, active subjects. And in semiotics, we have this theory that was popularized in Anglophone countries by Bruno Latour, the actor network theory, which is very similar to the idea that we share the very same environment with objects, we make sense of them, and they are with us as other active subjects. So I will shut up. I will say again, thanks a lot to Deborah for joining us, and I will just ask to her if can she tells more about this perspective, its roots, and how you got from sociology and media and cultural studies into this paradigm. So thanks a lot.
Yes, sure. I would be happy to talk about those issues. So maybe it might be useful to give a bit of my background, my intellectual background. So I actually was very much a Foucauldian scholar in my early career. And I was trained in sociology and biological anthropology, actually. So there was quite an emphasis on human biology in my undergraduate training, as well as in the social and cultural aspects of everyday life and everyday practices. I became very interested in sociology of health as well as an undergraduate. Then I went on to do a Master of Public Health degree. And that was really interesting for someone trained in sociology. It was also around the time that Foucauldian theory was really starting to have an impact in the Anglophone world. We're talking about the late 1980s and into the early 1990s when his work started to appear in translation, particularly his histories of sexuality, the different volumes involved there, and later on his work on governmentality and biopolitics and the care of the self became really influential, particularly in the sociology of health in Anglophone contexts, in Australia, in the UK, less so in the USA because medical sociology there tends to be less theoretical and more quantitative than in Australia and the UK, but also in Northern Europe, very much so in those people who were writing and researching in English and publishing in English. Foucauldian theory is very much the go-to. For those of us interested in the socio-cultural aspects, political aspects of health and medicine from the late 80s. So I did this very applied master's degree in public health, and I was there as one of the few people who had social science and even sort of theoretical social theory training. It was mostly medical doctors and those kinds of people who were studying the master's degree. I actually thought I would go into applied public health at that point. That's why I did that degree. But it was really interesting to be sort of there in the thick of it, to be a participant observer of how public health officials and practitioners are trained. I mean, I learnt epidemiology and biostatistics and health promotion and models of health behaviour and health economics, all those aspects. And I actually couldn't believe just how individualistic and theoretical and quantitative and uncritical all these approaches to public health and people's behaviours around health were, as someone who had been trained in sociology and anthropology. So I actually stayed on in that. It was in a faculty of medicine, a department of public health. So I stayed on in that department and did my PhD on HIV/AIDS and the way that HIV/AIDS was reported in the Australian press, using a very Foucauldian discourse analysis of the press reports, looking at language use, at discourse, at image use. So it was, you know, pretty much bordering on a semiotic analysis, because I did look at language and discourse and also imagery, you know, the way that headlines were configured in the news articles, the news actors who were represented in positive and negative ways. And of course, there was much there to say about stigmatised and marginalised groups around the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So I already had that real interest in media, as well as in sociology, as well as in Foucauldian theory, and I was bringing all those things together in my doctorate. Then I went on and became an academic and kept pursuing sociology of health and a lot of my research, but I also became interested in the sociology of digital media, because around that time too, we're now talking the mid-90s, there was, you know, personal computing was becoming dominant in people's everyday lives. Not yet the internet, but personal computers sitting on people's desks, incorporated into scholarly work, The early email system had begun to develop then, and we were talking about computer viruses, and I became quite interested in that, the semiotics of computer viruses, and the way that this human embodied metaphor was being used to talk about personal computers. So I started writing a sort of cultural analyses of the way that we think about our relationships with computers, and the sort of medicalised way and pathologised ways that we think about our bodies and about computer sort of / bodies and our interactions, and kind of our identities and those sorts of practices around computer technologies. So long story short, I've always been interested in embodiment. I've always been interested in the way that language and discourse is used and imagery is used, but also material things come together as entanglements of ways of configuring concepts of selfhood and subjectivity and identity and embodiment. So we're talking really about decades now of really me having that interest. So when I started reading, I have read, I obviously did read Latour's work when actor network theory and Latourian theory became more dominant in Anglophone social theory. But what I've become more recently interested in is the feminist new materialist philosophers, people like Rosie Braidotti, Jane Bennett, who's an American political scientist. I've always read Donna Haraway's work ever since, her Cyborg Manifesto had such an impact, which was published in the mid-1980s. So I've been using her work ever since then. But also Karen Barad's work, who obviously now fulfills the very position that Donna Haraway had in the History of Consciousness program, and was a student of Donna Haraway's. And of course, Karen Barad's work has become really influential in science and technology studies in particular. So I include those 4 feminist materialist scholars under the rubric of really interesting writers who are writing about embodiment and about, in their case, mostly environmental politics. They don't talk much about digital technologies, but what I've tried to do is bring in their sociomaterial perspective into an analysis of how we live with and through. Goes back to my old interest in how we live with and through our digital devices and also our data. And in fact, another book that I've published recently is called Data Selves, and it actually applies this approach to how we understand our what I call our digital data assemblages. So when the COVID pandemic erupted, and basically worldwide we began to hear about it in early February. And of course, I'm very aware that Italy was one of the first countries that was very badly affected by the pandemic. It never really has affected Australia. We've been very, very lucky because we're an island continent. We closed our borders and we're still not allowed out. We're sort of locked up in this vast continent. So very quickly they closed the borders, which of course is problematic because it does mean that we're very, very isolated, and that it's very hard for people to come in, whether they're Australian citizens or non-Australian citizens at the moment, and we can't get out. But anyway, that's another issue. But I realised quite early on that the COVID pandemic was going to be very disruptive, and it was going to be a pretty much unprecedented event for the world, just because I'd already had a lot of background in HIV, AIDS and other infectious diseases for a long time. So I started writing very quickly about the social aspects of the pandemic. And in the preface of the Face Mask book, each of the 4 authors of the book, we actually give an account of our everyday experiences of the face mask. And what I say in the preface is I tell about my experience when I went on a family holiday to Japan with my partner and 2 children, and noticing how many people were wearing a face mask. And I actually felt, this was in sort of late January 2020, so it was Japan was hearing about this new, infectious disease that was coming out of Wuhan in China, but they still weren't really worried about it, nor were most other countries yet. But so they weren't wearing face masks because of COVID. They were wearing face masks because it had already become an acculturated practice in Japan. Basically since the plague years in the early 20th century, actually, when Japan was hit by a few waves of the plague. And these days, Japanese people very routinely wear face masks, in winter particularly, and we were there in their winter, just to protect against any viral infection, just common cold or flu. I felt, and I noticed how many people were wearing face masks, and as a sociologist, I just took notice. Oh, that's interesting. But I did feel a bit uncomfortable because I felt like anytime I was in a crowded train or something and coughed or sneezed and I wasn't wearing a face mask, I felt like maybe I was being a little bit of a, deviant. Maybe they were looking at me and thinking, oh, this terrible European person who's not doing the right thing. So I did become quite sensitive to the whole issue of face masks. Meantime, I went back to Australia. We came back to Australia and we were having terrible bushfires in Australia at that time, which some of you may remember. It was called the Black Summer. It was our summer, the European winter. And we had terrible air pollution. So people actually started wearing masks then to protect against it actually can really badly affect your lungs if you breathe in all the pollutants in the air, if there's really bad bushfires nearby. And you could just see this thick pall of smoke in near when you looked outside the window. So I actually purchased a mask and started wearing it to go outside then, and I noticed some other people wear as well. But that was literally the first time I had ever worn a face mask, and any other Australian I had ever seen had worn a face mask. And then COVID struck. So that was another context within a few months that the whole issue of face masks began to be talked about in Australia and elsewhere. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm bringing together all those experiences, all those sort of observations, all that training in sociology of health, of embodiment, disease, contagion, infection, epidemics, pandemics. I mean, it just seemed an obvious thing to write about. So I proposed the book to my team. The other three authors are all, as you mentioned, postdoctoral fellows in my Vitalities lab. I thought it would be a great book for us all to work on as a team. And they all do bring interesting backgrounds in sort of creative, as you mentioned, Gabriele, creative writing. Marianne Clark comes actually out of body movement and kinesthetics and then into feminist sort of theory and the body. Clare Southerton is an expert on self-tracking and digital devices. So we were able to very easily decide which chapters we were mostly going to lead. I sort of, kept a close editorial eye on the whole book and made sure it was all written in a similar voice. And I wrote the introduction because I was very easily able to write about the history of face masks and infectious disease because, I have a background in that sort of thing. I wrote the concluding comments and added a few things to some of the other chapters. So that's the very long story, I suppose, of the provenance of the book.
Maybe I give the word to Marco Viola, who is our special discussant and who worked a lot on the theme of face mask. He also has recently published a very big article about the issue on a Nature review. So Marco, please, if you want to join us.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm thrilled that you invite Deborah, and doubly thrilled that you invited me to comment on her and her co-author's book. It's been a very nice reading, and before commenting, I want to stress why I'm here. Basically, as I joined Facets, which is a project mainly based on semiotics, although I don't come from semiotics. I studied analytic philosophy, but I'm trying to stop, and cognitive science. and I was interested in face expressions and in what the face communicates, and how much universality and culturality is there in facial expressions and so on. But then, when the pandemic also became a pandemic of masked faces, it reshaped our visual landscape. I went on doing some social psychology experiment to see how much social information is lost when we put on a face mask. Now, the fact is that, yes, of course, as I'm trying to prove right now, you cannot see the lower part of my face, so the mask prevents you to get some social information from my face. But then, the more I went into social psychology, the more I realized that this is just half of a story. In the lab, you can, of course, you can study how much you lose. For instance, here, you might not be able to recognize me if you don't see the lower part of my face, but there is another part of the story that needs to be told, because, for instance, here I'm bargaining part of my personal identity in favor of some social or fashionized identity. It is, I am communicating something more. So while psychology can tell us what the face masks make us lose in terms of social communication, we need qualitative semiotic and, or in this case, sociomaterial analysis to understand what it gives in addition, because that's way more complicated. And the face mask came to represent many things. There is a cacophony of meanings that is, of course, not exhaustively represented in the book, because you cannot grasp all of these. It's continuously evolving, and the book is probably discounts a bit of a delay, because you cannot just publish. The book has been written quickly, and that was meritoriously also from the side of a publisher. But of course, this pandemic was so fast that it rewrote the meaning of the masks so fast. I mean, it was probably conceived and written while Donald Trump was still a president, and USA was mostly unmasked continent. And in the meantime, and I might add, fortunately, they shift their attitude and everything. But still, the temporal contingency of this book makes it, if possibly, most precious, because it's a great and multifaceted portrait of several topics. I want to emphasize two topics that Gabriele or Bruno, I don't remember, mentioned before, that I very much appreciated. And if you like, I'd like to give a very brief comment on this. The first one is the last topic you deal with in the book. And sorry, I'm getting rid of this face mask. The face mask, as I said, the face mask do not only prevent you to see my face, but by putting the face mask in most countries and in most culture, that is, unless you're a no mask, the face mask means I care. Because most face masks are not the so-called selfish mask. And so people wear a face mask and sometimes even write on face mask, as if I remember correctly, is shown in one of your figures, because they care. This is a nice way to highlight our interconnectedness. And this is a fantastic chance, the pandemic, for scholars of health and sociology of health like you to show how much we are not alone. We are not Leibnizian monads when it comes to our bodies. But the second, and perhaps even my favorite part, is when you talk about breath. Or is breathing. Oh, sorry, I might be mispronouncing it, but still. Because the face mask is really a litmus test for our interconnectedness, not only with each other, but with the environment. I really much liked, although I was totally unaware of the modern human perspective that illuminates all the book, but it really, I really enjoyed it, and I must I'd like to trace a link with some perspectives that I know of from analytic philosophy of cognitive science. You might have probably heard of Andy Clark and David Chalmers' extended mind hypothesis, and with the trend of literature regenerates. While they focus mostly on the cognitive side of our extendedness, several other authors, when we come to Australia, I cannot think but of Kim Sternley, which is more biologically grounded than Clark and Chalmers, stress that we are not alone, that our mind is not a floating a brain in a vat in this world. But and so I was aware of the interconnectedness of mind because of this perspective in philosophy of mind. But the nice thing about your book that it puts the interconnected brain in an interconnected biological world. That is, we move from the brain to the body, and the body is a breathing body, and the breath is never seen in normal interactions, while it is seen in the night picture you took when it's frozen. But the face mask has been has allowed to see and to appreciate the breath, the importance of the porousness, as you repeatedly say, of our body, which is probably easier to understand that the body is not a model when you are a woman, because it's intuitive when we think about maternity, but I don't want to delve into this also because I don't know a thing about it. I'm really not aware, but the COVID and the face mask is a really great vantage point. And if I have to summarize the whole book, I'd say that the book is not only about face mask, it's about ourselves, the authors, but also ourselves in the pandemic, and the face mask offers a privileged, intelligent vantage point to look the world around it. It's not just about the mask in itself. The mask might be in some point an excuse, a perspective vantage point to look about ourselves, our bodies, our health, our practices, and our social communication. So there are really many stimuli, and I think I will draw on them in my further reflections about it. And well, thanks for putting it together.
Thank you, Marco. Yes, I too think that that you're right in pointing out that the face mask does become symbolic and does bring together so many things. And I mean, it's interesting that we yes, and the book is a shortish book. It's not hugely long, but it's interesting that we could find so many different perspectives to think about the face mask once we started thinking about it, and we were able to really look at it from quite a multi-dimensional perspective. And one thing we do emphasize as part of our more than human perspective is the issue about face masks as physical objects as they enter into the environment. And while they can be symbolic of care of others when we wear them, they're very obvious, symbolic, as you say, they're on our faces. I mean, that's the interesting thing about them too, is you can't, if someone's wearing one or if someone's not wearing one, you can't not notice. You notice their absence, you notice their presence because they're on our face, and you can't hide that usually. But what we also try and talk about, because we're going out from the human into the more than human environment, that we argue as part of our theoretical perspective that humans are always already part of more than human worlds, that we also need to consider the environmental issues of discarded face masks. So there is a section in our chapter about care, which is about not just care for humans, but care for other living things and for the environment, the natural environment, and that's something that's not always mentioned, but it's really quite interesting that there's this perspective in public health called One Health that's become quite dominant, and it's really, the pandemic itself has become this apotheosis as an exemplar of One Health, because we see a zoonotic virus passed on from either bats or pangolins. They're still not exactly sure, but we know it's from a wild animal in a wet market, probably in China, probably. There's so many environmental issues around the way that humans have totally ignored the care for the environment, you know, the way that we treat wildlife, the way that we've intensified farming has treated farmed animals and sort of destroyed environments to grow crops and to farm animals. Climate change. These are all imbricated, but within the emergence of new infectious diseases such as COVID-19. So that's also part of what we talk about in the book, a really important part of what we talk about in the book.
Maybe, if I can, I would like to mention, I already did it in my brief introduction, a kind of paradox related to the mask, because of course these kind of masks have rapidly become a kind of total institution. So everybody in the world in some way experienced the mask. Of course, in Italy, maybe more than in other countries, because we were more strongly affected by the pandemic. But anyway, it's kind of a common new feature of human beings, and this could be in some way this could imply a kind of rhetoric of a new humankind united under this big and umbrella of care of everyone and of everything, while in your book you underline how this is not true, because also behind this new social dispositive, minorities exist, and also this dispositive can become something that minorities can use in order to express themselves. So not only a sanitary device, but also a political, an artistic, a way to express ourselves device. So I think this is quite good, because of course it's sociological, semiotic. It puts together all our different perspectives. I don't know if you want to say something about it, because I think it's really interesting, because otherwise, if we just look at the issue by the common sense, we can see mask as something we are obliged to put on, is something compulsory. But there is also a world of possibilities related to masks. We want to aesthetize them. We want to put a meaning, a kind of sovereign structural meaning beyond the sanitary one on them. And I think you, in the theoretical part you build in your book, this is quite well explained. So if you want to say something about this, I would be happy to hear you.
Thank you. Yes, we do have a chapter about do-it-yourself cultures, and the way that the face mask did become very much an aesthetic as well as a hygienic object for some people, not for everyone, obviously. But this vast marketplace emerged on Etsy, which is the global online platform for people to sell handmade items, and it was really quite fascinating to explore on Etsy. I think there was also quite a shortage for a while. I know there was in Australia when people wanted to buy reusable face masks. Yes, there's an example of some of the ones I ordered from Etsy. As you can see, I like pretty masks. That's part of my aesthetic. And I talk about how I went for the vintage kind of floral fabrics, because that's me. I do like a floral fabric. And if I'm going to wear them on my face, I like them to be pretty. Yes. And they were expensive, as I mentioned there. I spent hundreds of dollars on these these lovely looking masks. I've got to say, I didn't like wearing them though. I still found it hard to breathe in them. But they do look nice. And so there's this vast market on Etsy where you can basically buy any kind of a mask with any kind of sort of pattern or design on it that you could possibly want for any occasion. So we talk in the book about, you can buy them for christenings, for bar mitzvahs, for weddings, for funerals, in loving memory of, you can get them in loving memory of, whoever has sadly died. But for happy occasions like, birthdays. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to see how the creative souls in this world, the people who like to sew and create objects with fabric, very much jumped onto this opportunity. So, yeah, that was quite interesting. And it also meant, if you supported a certain football team, you could get them, and or a political party. And of course, we have seen world leaders often wear masks that have the flag of their nation as a very nationalistic symbol. So yes, they're the semiotics of the mask really go beyond. Well, they're doing two things, aren't they? If you're wearing a mask that has a special customized design that you've spent time looking for and purchasing, then one is you are doing the hygienic, you're showing, yes, I'm hygienic, I'm going along with the idea that I'm caring for my health, but also those of others because I'm wearing a mask. But you're also signifying the kinds of things. I mean, I came to think of those kinds of masks that did have very personalized messages or patterns as a bit like message T-shirts, because you know how people, wear T-shirts with political slogans or just vintage prints on them, or brand names. T-shirts have been used for a long time now to display certain kind of ideas about that you want to display to the world about yourself. And in that way, masks actually, certainly the kinds of masks you can get on Etsy, actually serve that function as well. So yeah, we did spend quite a lot of time looking at those sort of semiotic issues. I was also interested because I also am a digital sociologist. We do talk a little bit about memes and pro and anti memes that were made in support of or against face masks. Also interesting for those who were anti-face masks, they could purchase face masks that were made of lace or a very wholey material that obviously weren't functional at all, but they put them on to sort of say, well, so what, I don't care. Yes, I'm wearing a mask because I'm kind of forced to, but I'm wearing a totally invalid mask just to prove that I don't care and I'm against it. Or even the face masks that had signs on saying, printed on, I'm only wearing this because I'm forced to. So yeah, a lot of interesting different signs coming together there.
Deborah, if you wouldn't have bring up about the memes, I would have asked something about that, because we are really, we've been and we are really interested in memes in general. So it's something that we studied a little bit also as regards the pandemic. So how this big discourse in which we were all everywhere, even though in different times, thrown together. So it's something really powerful that such ephemeral, most often, more than often, stupid things can carry so much meaning about how we position ourselves in the very moment, fronting this hyper object, which is the virus and the pandemic. But since you already addressed the memes and we invite people to purchase the book and read about them, I would like to ask you something which is as much as fascinating for me, and that it's really linked to the fact that you were talking about this. I would define them using this word that designers like a lot, which is skelomorphism. So these masks that have no function. So these masks that are just aesthetical and not working as health disposal and devices, etc. So my question is, and I want to say thank you to Marco because he recently handed us a paper or a newspaper article, something about that, which was talking precisely about the fact that a lot of people are starting, long story short, at the very beginning, we were all afraid about the fact, I myself was personally, I felt forced to wear the mask, and then eventually I wore it because we had to. But I remember the very day, and I made a selfie of myself the very first time I was forced to wear the mask in order to buy some stuff at the grocery store because I could not get in otherwise. It was, I think, really very late in Bologna. It was April the 19th in 2020, something like that, in which we were forced to wear it on the inside of a public store, etc. So it was a kind of small, big trauma for the reasons that Bruno was referencing. So the fact that we had to put another piece of our body that we didn't have before onto our body, and obviously embodiment and activism are part of the game. But so in the beginning, we were afraid, we didn't want to wear it, even though we were not definitely, we were no mask. Okay, so we were forced. Now we are completely familiarized with such device, and a lot of people, and even a bit myself personally, are starting to feel kind of naked without them. So, for example, this newspaper article that Marco posted into our private group of research, etc., was about people saying, I feel protected, but in a different way that maybe has something to do also with the gaze, also with a new kind of intimacy, and not being protected in the fashion of what we already know since decades that works in China or Japan. So they wear the mask because of the environment. Actually, also for this kind of intimacy. So sorry, I'm talking way too much, but I wanted to give you my perspective, and I wanted you to ask. I wanted to ask you if, according to your experience, personal and scholarly, you can kind of not do a prevision, not foresee something, but if if you can imagine to a certain extent, to some extent, what is going to happen to these masks when the emergency, we hope obviously as soon as possible, etc., is about to end? What's going to happen to this symbol that has generated so many symbols and that we feel equipped with?
Well, if I was going to be really pessimistic and depressing, I would say, the experts warn that there will be future pandemics after this one's dealt with. And in fact, experts are also saying that we may never fully deal with COVID and it will just keep popping up like seasonal flu. So if I'm going to be, just really, really pessimistic, one could argue that COVID actually won't ever really go away, and therefore there may well be good reason to, not always, but perhaps wear face masks, at least in sometimes, not some occasions. I mean, it's really interesting to think about. You probably wouldn't know much about how the pandemic's played out in Australia, but apart from the fact that we haven't been too badly affected. But we've also had differences between different regions, and we've only had one national lockdown, and that was fairly early on last year, but we've had lots of little short lockdowns whenever there's been an outbreak of even 1 or 2 cases, because we all panic then. And often the government of each different state in Australia the Premier of the state will say, right, there's a 3-day lockdown, everyone has to wear masks now, but otherwise they don't have to. So we go back and forth all the time in Australia, actually. and but it's really localized. So, you know, in Sydney, there was a short period of time when masks were mandated, but then they've only been mandated once again for a few days for a short lockdown. So we've just gone back and forth a lot in Australia. And in some parts of Australia, they've never been mandated because there were never enough cases to worry about. So yeah, it's really interesting just to compare, even within my own country, the differences in people's experiences of face masks. I do know that a lot of people I know who lived through the second lockdown that we had, which was in the state of Victoria and in the second largest city of Melbourne, they had a very long lockdown towards the end of last year, or mid to late last year, and they were mandated face masks for a long period of time. And I do remember my colleagues and friends living in that area saying they felt weird not wearing them anymore when they were no longer mandated. They're only mandated now, I think, on public transport, but other places they can not wear them if they don't want to. So all this to say is that my own experience and my own observations, at least in my own country, is that people seem to quite quickly get used to not wearing them if they don't have to, even when they've had to wear them for a long period of time. Having said that, I am aware that other people have enjoyed the anonymity of it. I think I did see that article that you mentioned. Young women have talked about liking being able to hide behind the mask and not getting the kind of attention in public that they were getting very sick of, for example. So that's another interesting perspective on it. But yes, I guess my answer would be it's complicated and it all depends. You know, it really does depend. I mean, I've lived in a place where we've hardly had to wear face masks at all throughout the pandemic. So, you know, we haven't got used to them, and I hate wearing them and still haven't got used to them just because I haven't had to wear them very often. So I think it'll really depend on a whole lot of factors, how vulnerable someone feels, whether they've been, I mean, the big politics now, of course, are about vaccination and risk. It's kind of moved on a little bit from the face mask, and now in Australia, I know, I'm not sure what it's like in Italy, but we've had terrible troubles rolling out a proper vaccination program. And so now people post selfies of getting the vax. It's like, ooh, finally got my vax. You know, forget the face mask issue. It's all about the vaccination. So maybe there's another book to be written about the politics of vaccination, actually, because that seems to be the next big issue around COVID. and just picking up on something that I think it was Bruno, could have been Marco, sorry, but one of you mentioned that, oh yeah, I think it was Marco, we talked about, like in the book, we actually start off by talking about President Trump and, you know, how anti-face mask he was. And we recognise that we wrote the book in a certain moment. It's already become like a social history of the first year. The face mask in the first year of COVID. We're now into the second year of COVID, and things are changing. And now, as I say, I think vaccination politics are now becoming the main issue. So, but what I would like to think is that, you know, it's an interesting social history, near history of the first year of the pandemic, and how important face masks were as a political object and not just a hygienic object in that first year, and all the controversies. We'll probably look back in a few years and just think, oh, you know, I can't believe all those controversies and politics around face masks.
You know, usually in a TV series, the sequel is worse than the original one. Let's hope the sequel of the COVID pandemic will be better than the first edition. And also, thank you for your cautious, prudent answer, because it proves that good sociology and good semiotics is not predictive, but it limits itself in being descriptive. But maybe for the conclusion, I will give again the floor to Marco. I see also there is a question in the chat, but maybe Marco can
no, thanks. I was just commenting again that that's a very interesting book. It's interesting also the history you mentioned about it, that is in Australia, face mask joined the party because of the bushfires, not because of the pandemics. And then they were re-exploited. And then the nice thing about the material objects, I found this underlined by Beth Preston. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She's a philosopher of culture in the Anglo-American tradition, but she's trying to smuggle the wisdom of continental philosophy and some feminist philosophy into the stubborn analytic tradition. And she teaches us that the material objects kind of have a life on its own. So face masks is a great example of that. They were introduced, at least in Australia, for one purpose, then they got repurposed, then people realized that you can have floral motifs or whatever on the face mask, so they gain a secondary, not technical, social sanitary, but design and fashion functions. And then there are some consequences when you are hearing impaired. That's a nice point. If you're planning to go back on a book on face mask, which you probably won't because you're right, but basin is the next big thing. But if anyone wants to come back on that, as I'd love to, but publisher don't agree with me, you'd really need to address, in my opinion, the history of transparent face mask. Because if I'm hearing impaired and I use lip movements to read whatever people say, I cannot do this when someone has a face obstructed. So I need face masks like these. This is particularly uncanny and makes me look like Hannibal Lecter. But this is one prototype of face mask which tries to overcome this obstacle. But there is a very nice history of care about people donating and doing themselves, or doing semi-professional, doing a transparent face mask and donating them to people who are in need, because the politics and the industry needs more time. So that's that. If you ever plan to do this, so let's keep in touch and let's write a nice, at least follow-up paper about the history of caring for the hearing impaired and how mask politics can become inclusive to everybody. But that's, of course, that's a tale for another day. For today, let me thank you again for this nice conversation and, of course, for the nice book.
Thank you, Marco.
Gabriele, you want to say something for the grand finale?
No, I'd say that I think this conversation was very stimulating. I wanted to point out some specific issues, but for example, some of them were already brought to light by Deborah without being stimulated by my questions. So I was super satisfied by what she told us. And yes, I think that since we are living the moment or the momentum, as they say, but the momentum is not so great, actually. I think that putting together different perspective, I do a kind of ring composition. I start from where I finish with from where we started. So my idea is that a kind of topic like all this stuff that we are constantly talking about and that we cannot get rid of on the plane of discourse. So even though when everything is gonna be over or it's going to be silenced from the biological and ecological perspective, we will go on, and it's something that we are aware and something that it's part of the game. The fact that we are about to talk about all of these way too much and anyway so much for a lot of other time. So since so many stuff has been written and maybe a new genre in scholarly specializations was born, the pandemic, the virus. If you go, I think it's the same everywhere, but if you go to the bookstores here in Italy, in the big chains, like one which is really engagé and cool, which is Feltrinelli, a big one. If you go to Feltrinelli, you find in a lot of cities the shelf that it's being devoted to this new genre, which is the virus and the pandemic, from the fairy tales for the kids that are educational, so you have to wash your hands and so on and so forth, to very specific psychological books and technical books. So what I want to say is that it's really, it's fun in the best way. And for me, the best way of doing research is doing something fun. But you have to be rigorous. Yes, of course. So it was really fun for me today to come to make a comparison and to put together different ideas, but which are converging also because they share a kind of a little bit of the very same roots, the very same history on this very topic. So there is one topic at the center, and we can, from our perspectives, trying to do a kind of editing or montage in which every perspective is useful to deal with different aspects of the very same subject. So I won't add anything. I want to say thank you, Deborah, a lot for joining us. We hope that we were able to make a good publicity to the book, and that we introduced it cleverly as much as we were capable of. So you will tell us about that, if we were good introducers and people to get in touch with and chatting and talking about scholarly and not only scholarly stuff. So I will shut up and I will give again the word to Bruno and to Deborah for, I don't know, a final remark or something like that. And also thank you, Marco, a lot, because your remarks were really interesting and on point. So thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele.
Well, I finish. I have the honorable role of the master of ceremony. So I show for the last time the cover of the book. Thank you, Deborah, but also thank Clare, Southerton, Marianne Clark, and Ash Watson. We presented today the face masking COVID times, a sociomaterial analysis, the Gruyter 2021. Deborah, you were delicious. Thank you for having accepted our invitation and for your exquisite participation today. And we strongly advise this book for, let's say, a wide range of audiences, not only sociologists, not only semioticians, but also not strictly academic people interested in this strange but nowadays common thing that is face mask. For all the other people interested in our strange stuff, we see you next week with another episode of Semi Boomer. So thank you, Deborah, and thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It was great.